Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're so glad you could join us for today's webinar, Sourcing Trends and Challenges in 2020, Highlights from USFIA's Annual Benchmarking Study. This event was organized by the United States Fashion Industry Association, representing brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the U.S. and doing business globally. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenters for the day. With us is the author of the study, Dr. Sheng Liu, Associate Professor at University of Delaware's Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies. Also joining us today to discuss the findings of the report is Lori Sutindar, Vice President of Global Sourcing at JCPenney Purchasing Corporation. And my name is Shannon Brady. I'm the Communications Coordinator at USFIA, and I'll be your moderator today. Please note that questions can be submitted at any time during the live program. Simply click on the question header on your webinar control panel, type your text into the box, and hit send. Our presenters will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. And if for some reason we experience a technical difficulty and lose audio, please refer to the chat box for further instructions. As a reminder, all registered participants will receive an email later today with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of today's session. So without further delay, I'd like to hand the floor over to Sheng to start our presentation. Sheng, are you able to hear me?
Oh, yes, sorry. So does it work?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Sorry for the technology. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Just want to say it's my great pleasure, always my great pleasure working with the U.S. Fashion Industry Association on this annual benchmarking study. And also, thank you so much to all the companies that participated in this study. Your inputs make this report possible. We very much hope that this benchmarking study can serve as a valuable source of information and insights about the U.S. fashion industry, fashion companies' sourcing practices, and their viewpoints on trade policy. And this year, our survey is based on 25 executives from leading U.S. fashion companies. We conducted the survey from April to early June. Around 70% of respondents report having more than 1,000 employees. So you can see these are very influential players in the industry. And these respondents represent various business types in the fashion industry, including retailers, fashion brands, importers, wholesalers, manufacturers, and sourcing agents. The full report is available from USFIA's website. And today I'd like to highlight the key findings in the study. And also I'm very glad that Lori from JCPenney can join me to share her additional insights and comments on the survey findings. Next slide, please. So first about the overall business environment. So like in the past, we asked respondents to identify 5 top challenges facing their business in 2020. And this year, really not surprising, the economic and business impact of COVID-19 is really the single most significant concern to fashion companies. And meanwhile, and we can see, the trade war is not over yet, and it remains the 3rd top challenge in 2020. And actually, the concern, if you look at the list, the concern about supply chain risk, the increasing production and sourcing cost, actually are also the results of COVID-19 and the trade war. So putting it this way, I think COVID-19 and the trade war are the 2 big themes for this year. And next slide, please. Yeah, so because COVID-19 is really on the top of people's minds, so why not let's just take a detailed look at its impact on companies' business operations. So first of all, just give you a context, why COVID-19 is such a big deal. So we know, the last time the fashion industry got a hard hit was back in the 2008 world financial crisis. However, if you look at a graph, the drop in U.S. apparel imports so far this year has been much worse than during the financial crisis. If you look at the GDP growth, I think the sales drop, I think all reflected the same trend. So the impact of COVID-19 has been much worse than a financial crisis. Next slide, please. So what are the exact impacts of COVID-19 on fashion companies? Sometimes when I read the news, I see a lot of discussion about store closure, consumers are not spending, but our respondents tell us COVID-19 has had a much more significant impact on their supply chain. And supply chain disruption caused by COVID-19, as you can see, come from multiple aspects. Okay, for example, it can be a lack of textile raw material, shortage of laborers, and even cannot conduct the regular factory audits due to travel restrictions. And also, the difficulty of finding shipping capacity. So the supply chain disruption really, is on the top minds of companies. Next slide, please. So more specifically, really not surprising. So almost all respondents expect their sales to drop this year due to COVID-19. And most commonly, companies say their sales drop will be around 1/3 from last year. Next slide, please. And because of, you sell less, so order cancellation is also very widespread in the industry. And we asked, both retailers, how many orders you've canceled, and also we asked brands and wholesalers how many of your orders got canceled. The results from both sides seems to be highly consistent. So in general, we find the cancellation has affected about 1/3 of the total orders. Next slide, please. That being said, respondents further tell us that they not only have canceled the orders for the second or the third quarter of this year, but also some orders for the rest of the year will be affected as well. So I think this is a reminder that the business difficulties caused by COVID-19 will not go away anytime soon. And I think U.S. fashion companies may have to prepare for a medium to the long-term impact of the pandemic. Next year, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then we also asked respondents, from where you mostly cancel your orders. And it turned out to be like 3 countries are affected by the order cancellation the most. China, Bangladesh, and India. I think there are 2 contributing factors. One is the size effect. So, for example, U.S. companies, source almost all kinds of products from China. So, of course, when you cancel orders, it is hard to avoid canceling orders from China. And also, these 3 countries are often used to fulfill large volume sourcing orders. And fashion companies probably no longer need to really place such large volume sourcing orders during COVID-19. So this is why I think these 3 countries are affected the most. Next slide, please. And further, it's a very challenging time, but fashion companies are trying their best to mitigate the financial impact of COVID-19 as much as possible. Okay, so you can see from the graph, some popular practices or strategies include exploring alternative sourcing options, trying to, more actively take advantage of duty saving benefits from trade agreements, or using the duty drawback, opportunities. But also, it's very important to recognize that there seems to be no one-fit-all model, but rather more than 40% of respondents tell us they have been trying 3 or more different strategies to mitigate the impact. And also, you can see really the impact is really big and broad, and probably you have to try multiple means. Next slide, please. And affected by COVID-19 and the worsened business environment, like the trade war. So respondents overall are more conservative about the next 5 years. So this year, those respondents that feel optimistic about the next 5 years fell to a record low, really unfortunate. And in comparison, you can see those hold a pessimistic view reached a new record high since we launched a survey in 2014. Next slide, please. The job market is not immune to COVID-19, okay? But at least our respondents expressed some hopes here. So this is my interpretation of the job market is really not something we should feel very excited about, but at least there's some hopes here. So nearly 90% of respondents still plan to increase hiring in the next 5 years. And I think this number is close to what we found in the past few years. That being said, not all types of job, will have the same opportunity in the future. So this is also true. So as you can see from the slide, so companies say, in the next 5 years, they're most likely to increase hiring more talents in certain areas like sustainability, compliance, market analyst, supply chain specialist, and a data scientist. But in terms of jobs like sewing machine operators, general management, still most companies actually will cut further those type of job. So so kind of the results tell us or reminds us the fashion industry is changing in nature, is continue its evolvement. Probably COVID-19 has accelerated this process. So for example, just this morning, I heard some industry discussion about how the kind of the data science or digital technology has been increasingly implemented by fashion companies. All right, so I will stop here for a moment and let Lori to share her comments about the impact of COVID-19 and her firsthand observation about the overall business environment this year. Lori?
Thank you, Sheng, and good afternoon. And a thank you to Julie Hughes and the USFIA for giving me the opportunity to join this call today. This is a very interesting time in retail, and it's a perfect time to be looking at the industry outlook based on what's happening. The obvious impact of COVID-19 on the retail industry stretches all the way from the impact to our customer, to our stores, to retailers, to cargo vessels, to manufacturers and raw material providers. It's interesting to see how these changes have impacted and will continue to evolve as we work through the COVID-19 situation. Regarding the impact to retailers and brands, it is interesting to watch how some of these will play out in 2020 and into 21, and how retailers will react to these changing trends. For example, what will be the impact of back-to-school selling period with so many schools delaying in-person classes? Will the timing for back-to-school selling shift to be later? What products will come to the forefront of selling in this new back-to-school environment? And even how do we even begin to plan next year's back-to-school? Another good question is, with so many stores announcing they will be closed on Thanksgiving Day, will this shift the holiday peak and how the customer shops? Will the customer shop more in store or more online? And how do we as retailers adjust to that? Also, with many brands and retailers closing their doors permanently, how will these customers shop now? Where will they shop now? Where will this market share flow in this new business environment? And with so many people in the US still working from home, how have their apparel buying patterns shifted? There's so much discussion now on the increase in casual apparel and the decline of what we would call typical wear to work apparel. Think about yourself and your family and your friends. Are you shopping differently? And then how, as we as retailers, how do we react to that? And then obviously, I think the most obvious shift with COVID-19 is the shift from brick and mortar stores to the e-commerce or .com sales. How will this trend continue? And how do we as retailers adapt to that trend to be able to take advantage of this? I also wanted to take a moment to comment on your slide, Sheng, about the industry and the impact of talent that's out there. You mentioned how respondents are seeing a shift in their hiring patterns in the types of roles we expect to see increasing around sustainability roles, supply chain roles, sourcing and data analysts. I think it will be interesting also to see how that shift is impacted by COVID-19. And as more companies adopt a work from home policy, how are companies going to take advantage of more widespread talent as virtual workspace becomes more of a norm and more 3D and virtual sampling becomes more important in a work from home environment? So it's certainly an interesting time to look at the business environment and how it's going to shift. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to you now, Shannon.
Thanks, Lori. So we have a few polls for our audience today. We really want to get you involved on the discussion as well. And our first poll question is, what is the outlook of your company's business in 2021? And you can select one of the following: much better than 2020, slightly better than 2020, no change, or even worse than 2020, or hard to tell. So we'll give you a few seconds to submit your answers, and then we'll show the results. So thank you to everyone who voted. According to our audience, 40% see that 2021 will look slightly better than 2020. So Sheng and Lori, I wanted to give you a chance to see if you had any comments before we move on to the next slide.
Hi, it's Lori. I would say that most people probably are very optimistic that 2021 will look a little better, just simply because many stores were closed for a portion of 2020. And so we'll be able to hopefully make up that business as we go into 2021. But it is very encouraging to see, that 64% do see better in 2021 than 2020. So that's good news for our industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with Laurie and also agree with our audience. So looks like, there are some hopes there. So 2021 will be better than this year, but also still there are a lot of uncertainties out there because, it's the pandemic that sets the agenda, not us. So still, I see quite a few choose hard to tell. And also even it's a recovery, but it could be a multi-year, kind of process. Yeah, back to you, Shannon.
Great, thank you.
All right, so it looks like it's my turn again. Sure, so now let's move on to the sourcing part, my favorite part of the study. So this year, our respondents report sourcing from as many as 45 different countries and regions, and this is close to 48 in 2019. And highly consistent with the macro trade statistics, you can see Asia as a whole remains the dominant sourcing base for US fashion companies. 8 out of the top 10 most utilized sourcing destinations are based in Asia, led by China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. And US, Mexico are the only 2 non-Asian countries that make to the top 10 list. Next slide, please. So So despite COVID-19, we find some sourcing patterns actually are quite stable. For example, like you see from the graph. So in general, we find still, companies larger in size tend to use a more diverse sourcing base. So those respondents report having more than 1,000 employees. They typically source from more than 10 different countries or regions. And those companies with less than 1,000 employees, and this year they say they mostly source from less than 6 different countries or regions. Next slide, please. And regarding companies' detailed sourcing portfolio, we find the so-called China plus Vietnam plus Manning model remains the most popular among respondents. But just be careful, and the meaning of this model actually is evolving. So you may recall back in 2016 when we named this sourcing model for the first time. China typically accounted for like 30 to 50% of a company's total sourcing value or volume. Okay, China remains the most utilized sourcing base, but starting from last year, very interesting, we noticed China was no longer always the top supplier for some U.S. fashion companies. And likewise, this year we find around 29% of respondents indicate they source more from Vietnam than from China, and which was even higher than 25 last year. And instead, we find China and Vietnam combined now typically account for 40 to 60% of U.S. fashion companies' total sourcing value or volume. And then companies also source from a few additional countries, such as Mexico, CAFTA members, the rest of Asia, and the United States. But each of these additional sourcing base typically accounts for less than 10% of a company's total sourcing value or volume. Next slide, please. Okay, so because all the attention is given to COVID-19, so why not let's take a detailed look at how COVID-19 and the trade war have affected U.S. fashion companies' sourcing practices. And once again, some impacts are not new to us, but some are not really expected. First, this year, we find the pressure of sourcing and production cost remains a big concern to companies. Okay, and you can see really the driving factor for the pressure of sourcing cost is not about labor, it's not about material, but it's about shipping and logistics. Okay, but at least first of all, from this graph, we can see 70% of respondents expect their sourcing cost continue to go up in 2020. So we know last year the sourcing cost has increased a lot, but 70% expect the sourcing cost continue to go up this year. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as I just briefly mentioned, in the past, the key driving forces of production and sourcing cost is labor and textile raw material. It's because of the nature of the product, but neither is a kind of really a big concern this year. So we know, the cotton price was down in the first full month of this year, but rather, the biggest driver of sourcing cost in 2020 is the shipping and the logistics, and around 1/3 of respondents expect this type of cost to substantially increase in 2020, which is even worse than last year. Last year is about trade war, but this year COVID-19 actually make the situation even worse. So why is that? Why is shipping and logistic cost is going up? I did some study, and according to some media reports, shipping companies are applying surcharges to some international shipping during a pandemic. And also, due to various types of quarantine measures, sometimes companies may have to switch to a more expensive shipping route. Next slide, please. So maybe at this point you are thinking, is it, the cost increase is mainly, caused by COVID-19 and has little to do with the trade war? No worry. We did ask respondents, how has the trade war affected your company's sourcing? And you can see from the graph, as high as 90% of respondents say the U.S. Section 301 action has increased their company's sourcing cost in 2020. Okay, and I think this result is up from last year. Last year when we conducted this survey, so last April, Section 301 actually hasn't affected most apparel products yet, because apparel is mostly covered by List 4A, which was implemented in September. Okay, but this year you can see the impact is really there. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Section 301 is on China, so understandably, companies, are trying to reduce their exposure to sourcing from China. I have to say, reduce sourcing from China is not a totally new trend. As early as in 2014, when we began a survey, some respondents have told us they're looking for the next China. Just in the current business environment, especially because of the trade war, it seems companies are accelerating their process of diversifying sourcing from China. So we can see from this graph, only 1/3 of respondents say they source more than 30% of their products from China this year, and this is a record low. Next slide, please. Okay, so companies are sourcing less from China, then where they go? According to our respondents, companies are mostly moving their sourcing orders to China's competitors in Asia. And meanwhile, we can see from the graph, very few respondents say they are moving orders from China to countries in a Western Hemisphere. Okay, so if you think, trade war has benefit near sourcing or onshoring, and actually, there's a question mark here. Next slide, please. And we really can compare the survey result with the macro trade statistic shown on this slide. So you can see they're really highly consistent. So in the first half of 2020, which is the latest data just available to us, China's market share in the U.S. apparel imports fell to a record low. Okay, and whose market share has been rising? It's Bangladesh, it's ASEAN members, which include Vietnam. Okay, and also just a quick note in terms of value, Vietnam actually was the #1 largest apparel supplier to the U.S. market in March and April, which is really unprecedented. But trade data also shows that U.S. companies are importing less apparel from the Western Hemisphere. Next slide, please. Yeah, so continue with the numbers in the previous slide. So we cannot conclude that COVID-19 and the trade war have benefit near sourcing from the Western Hemisphere. So Western Hemisphere, as you can see from this table, overall is, it is a very important part of company sourcing portfolio, but in general, the region just accounts for less than 10% of a company's total sourcing value or volume. And this is the case for, NAFTA members, CAFTA members, and also, for local sourcing from the US. Next slide, please. Yeah, some additional numbers here. So, so this is from OTAXTA, the official trade statistics. So you can see both in terms of value and quantity. So fewer apparel imports actually come from the Western Hemisphere, especially from CAFTA members. Okay, so look like the interest is there. If you ask companies, are you interested in sourcing more from the Western Hemisphere? Yes, but they have taken much fewer actions. So why is that? I think probably there's two factors behind this phenomenon. One is why companies source from Western Hemisphere. It's not, it's not because of price, but rather it's because of speed to market. Instead, I think price is a disadvantage of sourcing from the region. But we know during COVID-19, U.S. consumers are ever more price sensitive because their budget is tighter. Okay, so of course, sourcing from this from the Western Hemisphere may suffer some disadvantage in terms of price when competing with Asian products. And also, don't forget, COVID-19 is a pandemic, and definitely the production capacity and of those garment factories in Mexico and Central America has been cut a lot. So of course, if you even have to import most of your textile materials from outside, and the disruption on shipping and disruption on production also affect sourcing from the region. Okay, next slide, please. One thing I personally feel very encouraged is that despite COVID-19 and the financial challenges, companies are not ignoring sustainability and social compliance. Okay, and in fact, about 70% of respondents say they will allocate more resources to improve their sustainable and responsible sourcing, and this percentage actually is higher than last year. For example, companies really care about how their products are made. So like what we found in the past, 100% of respondents say they audit their factories, and 85% are working with third-party certification programs. Next slide, please. And also, companies care about who is making their products. So very similar to the results in the past few years, the vast majority of respondents say they map their supply chains, especially the tier 1 and the tier 2 suppliers. And moreover, we find the size of the company is a very interesting factor. So, you can think in this way. So larger companies theoretically should have more resources to map their supply chain. Okay, but as mentioned earlier, larger companies also typically source from more countries and regions, and this factor may make it more challenging to gather information from all these sources. So this is why you can see the numbers here. Larger companies, for some suppliers, they kind of more actively mapping where they come from, but that's not all always the case. Next slide, please. Yeah, and also we asked respondents about the challenges they face when they try to map the supply chain. Kind of three challenges stand out. One is, the factories, the vendors are not always very cooperative. Maybe they do not want to, kind of disclose all their subcontractors. And second, it's about the nature of our industry. Really, really challenging to know, especially to know your tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers. And also the lack of financial resources is one more concern to companies. Next slide, please. Yeah, audit. Just want to add one more quick comment. A very interesting trend this year is we find more companies say they're both working with the third-party certification programs and also conducting their own audits. My guess, really just a guess, is that maybe it is related to the Xinjiang forced labor kind of this kind of concern. Because this is really new, it's very sensitive and very complex, and maybe it's not covered yet by traditional auditing programs. So companies may have to do their own audits. Next slide, please. All right, so next, due to COVID-19, we further find that the sourcing diversification strategy is slowing down, and more U.S. fashion companies are switching to consolidate their existing sourcing base. So you can see, if you look at companies' comments, though you hear a lot of comments like, I want to work with fewer suppliers, or even source from fewer countries. So we know to carry out the sourcing diversification strategy typically requires substantial new investment. Okay, it's from capital to human resources. So it's not just a case, okay, I just want to add a new factory. It's not that simple. You have to do a lot of homework and have to make a lot of investment. But this year, making these new investments are not really affordable to many fashion companies. And instead, respondents tell us, they find it more urgent and rewarding to consolidate their existing sourcing base and resources because they want to strengthen the relationship with their key vendors. Next slide, please. And related, when we asked about, how companies' sourcing base may continue to evolve through 2022, and for the first time since we launched the survey, none of the respondents plans to substantially increase sourcing from any particular country or region in the world. So in the past, always some companies say, I will substantially increase sourcing from a particular country or region, but not this year. And this unusual result really reminds us how severe COVID-19 has affected the fashion industry. And just like what we just see from the poll, the recovery will be a multi-year process, I think. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is also a very kind of informative question. So we asked respondents, to provide their rating, try to make it as objective and fact-based as possible. The rating for each primary sourcing destinations. Just this year, we expand the criteria from 4 factors to 5 factors, but all of these factors are what companies typically consider when they decide where to source their products. And on the slide and in the table, you can see, just like how we rate hotels or restaurants. So the numbers, the numbers means the score each country received. 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And I also add some signs to make it easier to read. So the round green means strength, the yellow triangle means average performance, and the red diamond means weakness. So first, regarding speed to market, not surprising, US, Mexico, and members of CAFTA, they outperform most Asian suppliers because of their geographic locations. And respondents also say, the lead time is shorter when they source from China, from Vietnam, than from the rest of Asia. And I think this is largely because of the overall supply chain capability in these 2 countries. Regarding sourcing cost, respondents say made in Bangladesh is still the most competitive, and followed by Vietnam, China, India, and Sri Lanka. The rest of Asia, the AGOA region, CAFTA, NAFTA members are average, but you can see, sourcing from the US, from Europe, they will incur the highest sourcing cost. And then in terms of flexibility and agility, which means, how quickly a vendor can adjust the shipping volume or product, through the, in their sourcing orders upon request of customers. And China did it the best, because we know China has an unprecedented or unparalleled kind of production capacity, and its network is really integrated. And Vietnam, but also this year we can see Vietnam is quickly catching up. Okay. And then in terms of the risk of labor, social, and environmental compliance, respondents give the highest rating to US and Europe. But also you can see, many Asian countries, they have relatively lower score in terms of environmental risk. I think this is largely because most apparel production physically happens there. So in terms of pollutions, water usage, understandably there are a lot of concerns there. Just to wrap up, two comments. First, from this table we can see really no sourcing destination is perfect. No sourcing destination is perfect. And this probably explains, why we see companies typically use a wide variety kind of sourcing destinations to balance all these sourcing factors. Okay, cost, speed to market, flexibility. I just use different sourcing bases to fulfill these needs. And a second, can you click the slide, please? Yeah, so overall, we can see China, Vietnam, Mexico, and CAFTA members, they're regarded as the most balanced sourcing destinations against all the sourcing criteria. And I think personally, I think this is, itself, being a balanced sourcing destination itself means a competitive advantage. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for the last part, I'd like to make a quick comment about the outlook of sourcing from three to four leading sourcing destinations. The first is China. So not surprising, we see most companies want to reduce sourcing from China further. But also I want to say that it is not the case. It's not a case that companies are stop sourcing from China or really want to give up sourcing from China. Okay, or put it this way, I think China is still highly relevant. Next slide. Yeah, just look at this graph. Okay, so this graph, shows China's market share, okay, in the U.S. The data is from Otexa. So we know, as the first country hit by COVID-19, China's apparel exports to the U.S. were cut by more than half, at the beginning of the year. But if you look at the data, starting from April, China's market share or China's apparel export to the U.S. are really going through a V-shaped recovery. Okay, and by June 2020, okay, more than 40% of U.S. apparel imports measured in quantity and more than 30% in value still come from China. Okay, so this is why, and I think really indicates companies' interest in continuing working with China. That being said, really sourcing is really intriguing, interesting, always dynamic. That being said, as we noted, and you can read our benchmarking study, as we noted in the study, the concern here is about non-economic factors, from trade war, the Xinjiang issue, and also the anti-Chinese sentiment, the overall anti-China sentiment. And all of these non-economic factors, I think, will complicate the prospect of sourcing from China in the rest of the year or even longer. Next slide, please. Yeah. Next is about Vietnam. I think Vietnam, we still can call it a rising star for apparel sourcing. But at the same time, we can see respondents are turning more conservative about Vietnam's growth potential. So how much more Vietnam can export to the world? So we know on August the 1st, Vietnam and EU free trade agreement finally enters into force. And Vietnam is also a member of CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP without the US, okay, we call it. So this means Vietnam is on track to enjoy duty-free access to more than half of the world's apparel import markets. So, US companies, you want to source more from Vietnam, but don't forget, EU companies, Japanese companies want to do the same. So the question is, how much more Vietnam can export and really fulfill all the sourcing orders. So there's a question mark here. Next slide, please. Yeah, and Bangladesh is the third top sourcing destination this year in our survey, and respondents overall maintain a relatively high level of interest in sourcing from the country in the next 2 years. Well, the opportunity for Bangladesh is that, companies want to leave China, and Vietnam's capacity is full. So definitely, I think, Bangladesh will be the next best choice. So I think, this is where, the opportunity, comes from. And also don't forget, price advantage means a lot these days. That's Bangladesh. Okay. Next slide, please. So this year, still respondents expressed, increasing or modest potential. We can see some modest potential of increased sourcing from locally, from the U.S. But the tricky part, always, personally to me, the tricky part is how you can bring the whole supply chain back to the U.S. It's not just about setting up 1 to 2 factories, but how to bring the whole supply chain back to the U.S. Especially doing so will require substantial new investment, but it's not really the perfect timing to make it happen. All right, I think I've talked a lot, so I will give the floor to Laurie. Feel free to comment on the findings. What do you agree? What do you find different from your personal observations or any new sourcing trends we should keep watching? Laurie?
Thanks, Sheng. This is my favorite part of the survey too, so it's funny when I hear you say that. But you're right, sourcing trends and the impact of COVID is really an important part of what's going on with us in our environment, and a great topic for us to talk about as brands and retailers and importers today. With the shift in the customer buying and the impact of many brands and retailers being closed due to COVID-19, we do see that impact in the supply chain, and that goes all the way back to, as you're talking about, the countries of production. We are dealing with some countries having reduced capacities due to shutdowns due to COVID, and this combination with store closures and COVID in countries of production has impacted factories' efficiencies, their capacities, and even their cash flows. This is really leading brands and retailers to doing just what the survey shows, relooking at your supplier base, looking at your country of origin base. We are seeing some consolidation like your survey showed, and some expansion even in some areas. But I think what you said is correct. It's all coming down to a matter of balance. How do you balance and mitigate your risk against the needs of what you have? We're looking for quality and flexibility and value and compliance about what's really available out there in the countries of production. And I also think this is going to be challenging in the short term, as international travel is still a headwind for U.S. teams. So retailers and brands that have a strong overseas support network will have an advantage because they'll have boots on the ground to help them navigate through the COVID situation when travel is an opportunity. There's still so much that's unknown for what 2021 will look like, but I do think that flexibility will become one of the top metrics that retailers and brands are looking for as they look at where to produce their goods, because it is such a fluid situation. Also, I wanted to just hit on for a minute, you did talk a lot about the increase in the interest of the topic of sustainability. I always think of sustainability in 2 parts, obviously the product part, what's in the actual product, but also the sustainable production part. And I just want to comment, I think this is becoming a really more important requirement that customers are looking for. And we see that reflected in the survey. We see that reflected as people are hiring more talent that has sustainability or sustainable production practices and that competency. And I think that this is going to become the new normal, the new price of entry for suppliers as we move forward. And then just one brief last observation. I also thought it was interesting to see the increase in the hiring of data analysts. I think this is showing the trend of the way that decisions are being made. I think that retail will always be a blend of the art and the science, but we're seeing this trend of the science increasing in importance. And I think overall too, we're going to be seeing a lot more pressure be put on suppliers and where we're producing goods to help the retailers and the brands in all of these buckets. So I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon then.
Great, thank you, Lori. We have a few more poll questions based off of the sourcing practices section of our presentation. And the first, going back, I'll launch the poll here. We want to know, how do you expect the Xinjiang forced labor issue to affect your company's sourcing strategy? You can select one of the following. Do you expect a significant impact, a minor impact, or no impact? We'll give you all a few seconds to answer that question, and then we'll move on to our next poll question, and we will reveal the answers once we've moved through all the poll questions. Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to close that poll, and our next question, we want to know if you think any of the following sourcing bases will emerge as the next China for apparel. So you can select one of the following: Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, or the Western Hemisphere. We'll give everyone a few seconds and we'll move on to our next poll questions, and then we'll review all of our results. Okay, great, thank you. And our next question, does your company plan to increase apparel sourcing from the Western Hemisphere in the next 2 years? Yes, no, or hard to say? Okay, we'll close that poll, and thank you to everyone who voted. We're now going to share the results of those polls, and the first poll was related to the Xinjiang forced labor issue. So you can see that 45% of respondents see a significant impact on their company sourcing strategy. Sheng or Lori, do you have any comments?
Hi, it's Lori. I would just say I can completely understand why we are seeing the 45% and the significant impact. I think everyone's trying to really educate themselves to understand the issue, and then how will they take the steps to mitigate their risk. So I think we'll see this topic come up a lot more go forward.
Yeah, me too. I totally agree with Laurie.
Great, and we'll show the results of the next question, which is on sourcing bases emerging as the next quote-unquote China for apparel. As you can see, you know, a strong response for Vietnam, but also Bangladesh.
Yeah, I think all of us would agree that we've definitely seen the growth happening in Vietnam, you know, over the last few years. But it is encouraging to see the respondents talking a little bit about Ethiopia or Bangladesh as opportunities to continue to grow the business. So these will be interesting to watch how this trend plays out.
Yeah. I want to add one quick comment. You know, I just checked the data from the World Trade Organization to look at the patterns of the world textile and apparel trade last year. Vietnam really stood out last year. It's more than just apparel exports from the countries increasing. Vietnam has become the 7th largest textile exporter in the world. So this means Vietnam's textile and apparel industry is really upgrading. It's more than just about expanding, but also it's upgrading. So this really makes Vietnam a country really, you know, we should pay attention to. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And our final poll, the results were, does your company plan to increase apparel sourcing from the Western Hemisphere in the next 2 years? You know, we see a strong response for no or hard to say, but 23% said yes.
Yeah, kind of very, you know, very consistent with what we found in the survey. So the interest is there, but in terms of the actual action, I think companies are more hesitant.
Yep, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And another thank you to our audience for participating in those polls. And Sheng, I'll hand it back over to you.
Sure. So this is the last part, and I notice we are running short of time, so I'll be quick. So the third part of the benchmarking study is companies' viewpoints on trade policy. So the first issue we always examine is, how companies or how actively companies are utilizing trade agreements and trade preference program. And I have to admit, really, I have to admit, the result you see on the slide is not what I totally expected. So I thought, due to trade war, companies, should be more interested in exploring the duty-saving benefits. But this is not the case. Except AGOA, Chorus, and Egypt QIZ, most U.S. FTAs and trade preference programs has been used less this year. And next slide, please. However, after checking the OTEXTA data, it showed the same trend nationwide. So you can see the percentage of U.S. apparel imports entered under FTA also fell to a record low so far this year. So the reason is, or look like the reason is, because U.S. companies are sourcing less from these FTA regions. So of course, they claim less usage of these trade programs. Next slide. But two programs I do want to highlight. One is USMCA, or we commonly call it NAFTA 2.0, NAFTA 2.0. So because the uncertainty for the agreement is mostly gone, it enters into force last month. So compared with a year ago, our respondents demonstrate more readiness and interest in using USMCA for apparel sourcing purposes. So, both for those companies which are currently sourcing from the region, and even for respondents currently do not source from the NAFTA region. Okay, so they say they will more actively explore or consider, using USMCA for sourcing in the future. Next slide, please. And also we asked respondents about their viewpoints for the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So this is a very important trade preference program. Two quick comments. First, we find companies' interest in sourcing from the AGOA region and also taking advantage of this trade preference program is going up, is coming back. Respondents also see the so-called third country fabric rule is very important for them to source from the region. That being said, we find U.S. fashion companies still, demonstrate a low level of interest in investing directly, in the AGOA region. And respondents tell us, their concern mostly is about the temporary nature of AGOA, and also, how this agreement, will evolve after it got expired in 2025. And next slide, please. So related, so we asked respondents, how do you want AGOA, to evolve or to change after 2025? So we gave them 4 options. So kind of the top choice for respondents is just to make no change to AGOA, renew it for 10 more years. I think this is understandable. This means they can continue sourcing from a region, enjoying the liberal rules of origin, and really they will lose nothing. Okay. The second top choice is, it's okay for companies to replace AGOA with a permanent trade agreements, but also, these trade agreements keep the third country fabric rule. Okay, so there will be some changes, of course, and also how likely, this will happen is hard to tell. But at least I think companies also very welcome for this choice. Next slide, please. The least favored policy option is just to let AGOA expire, and there's no replacement, no new trade agreements. Why companies don't like it? Because this means they will lose, all their current benefits. Okay, if they want to source from the region, no duty saving benefits. Of course, also no third country fabric rule. The most controversial policy option is, we replace AGOA with a permanent free trade agreement. However, these trade agreements will adopt the more restrictive yarn forward rules of origin. So this means companies have to maybe, restructure their supply chain so as to continue the duty-free sourcing from the region. So in the report, we provide more analysis on these four options. Next slide, please. Yeah, so because of time, I have to stop here, but just let you know, there are many additional timely and important topics we cover in the study, from companies, how companies are trying to source, socially responsible, and also, how they, what kind of non-tariff barriers they face. So I encourage, each one to read the report, and definitely please let us know if you have any feedback and suggestions for the report. So thank you again for the great opportunity, and I'll give the floor to Laurie. Yeah, Laurie.
Thanks, Sheng. I know we're running out of time, but I would just say I do appreciate everything that you've shared with us today, and the opportunity to comment on today's or this year's report. Thanks to Julie and Shannon and the USFIA team for inviting me to speak. I think it's going to be a really interesting year as we go forward, and I think the learnings in this report can really help us as brands and retailers as we think about our sourcing strategy. So thank you so much for letting me participate.
Great, and thank you both. I know we are close to the time, but wanted to take a few audience questions before we wrap up, and I'll quickly. We do encourage attendees, if you have any other questions, we welcome you to submit them using your dashboard, or you can always follow up with USFIA at info@usfashionindustry.com. And this question is for Sheng and Lori. Do you foresee the China 301 tariffs being changes to the China 301 tariffs in the next year?
Laurie, why not you go first?
Wow, that's a loaded question, actually. I think a lot will depend on what happens truly with the election this year and if we'll see any changes in the 301 situation. So I think that could be pivotal about what changes in 301 or not. So I think a lot of us would like to see those tariffs go away because of the impact to us as retailers and brands. But I think a lot has changed pending the election. I would say we'll see more what will happen. Sheng, I don't know if you have a different view.
Yeah, I have to say this is not my expertise. As an economist, I always predict wrong. But personally, I doubt Section 301 tariff will go away anytime soon. So probably, this is an issue that will last for a while, even we have a new president. Yeah, Shannon.
Great, thank you. And our final question. What do you think it will take to turn kind of the interest in sourcing in the Western Hemisphere into actual increased sourcing from the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I can go first. So I actually just made another presentation comparing U.S. apparel sourcing from the Western Hemisphere versus sourcing from Asia. One big difference of these two regions is Asia actually is always changing. Okay, yeah, if you look at the data, always 70% or 80% of U.S. apparel imports come from Asia. But in terms of the specific countries where we source from, it's always changing. A few years ago, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they're still relevant, and then later on, China stepped in, and these days we talk a lot about Vietnam and Bangladesh. However, all these countries, they share one common feature, that is the supply chain is based on Asia, and such a supply chain is becoming ever more integrated and competitive. However, if you look at Western Hemisphere, okay, there's little change over the past decades. You can say, the supply chain, cooperation between the U.S. textile industry and garment factories in Mexico and in Central America is very strong. But I can also say, there's no improvement. Always they rely on textile material from the U.S. But why not they just, make efforts to create their own local textile industry, so that they can provide more variety, different kinds of products, and even can improve the price competitiveness of their products. If you look at the data, 80%, or even 90% of Mexico's apparel exports still go to the US. The same with no change compared with 10 or even 20 years ago. Personally, I see this is a kind of a concern here. So how to make the Western Hemisphere supply chain more dynamic, include more industrial upgrading to expand their production capacity rather than have to rely on single source of textile material, just focus on supplying certain, particular type of products, I think is something we can think about. Yeah.
I think it's a great answer, Sheng. I think it's really a combination of the raw material availability and your cost versus speed equation. And that's the way that you can take advantage of the Western Hemisphere, and you have to really learn to figure that out. So I think that's what it will take for us to see an increase there.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Sheng and Lori, for such an insightful presentation. We are going to conclude today's webinar on that note. And as a quick reminder to attendees, you will receive a follow-up email containing the slide deck and a recording from today's program. As I mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions. You can contact USFIA directly by emailing us at info@usfashionindustry.com. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you at the next USFIA event.
Thank you.
Thank you.